now broadcasting live from Exeter University. I'm Richard Toy. I'm a professor in the history department, but I'm also director of postgraduate research for the College of Humanities. And we're here to have a discussion about how to develop a research career in the humanities, taking the first steps towards a PhD, and what the purposes, nature, and career prospects from doing a PhD in the humanities are. So the first thing that I would like to do would be to ask our panel members to introduce themselves, starting from, first of all, on my right. James, please.
Okay, yes, hello, I'm James Clark. I'm Professor of History at Exeter, but also Associate Dean for Research in Humanities.
Hi there, I'm Emma Cayley, and I am the Head of the Humanities Department here at Exeter.
I'm Susanna Cornwall. I'm Advanced Research Fellow in Theology and Religion, and also Admissions Tutor for Theology and Religion.
I'm Matt Barber, and I work in the Graduate School of Humanities, and I look after admissions.
Now, people should feel free to submit questions via the Google Hangouts, but we're going to start with a sort of a few broad areas that we thought would need to be covered. The first of which is how do I know if a PhD is for me? What's it involve? What are the qualities required, and what career paths can it lead to? So, James, if I could turn to you first to address some of those issues.
Okay, I think for the first question, is a PhD for me? A PhD really has to start with an idea that is so compelling to you that you feel that you have to pursue it further. Not an idea necessarily that you know at this point precisely how you can unpack it, take it forward, but one nonetheless that you know that you can commit to intellectually and practically over a number of years. A PhD isn't a small and easily resolved set of questions, but it's a problem that really could be unpacked in a much more detailed way. And but if it's compelling enough to you, there's a good chance that you can present it to a university in a way that they will want to buy into it as well.
I mean, I suppose it's worth saying that, of course, people often think of doing a PhD as a sort of a lonely and solipsistic process, but of course there is that dimension to it, but also it is also about participating in a research culture.
Absolutely, it's your entry point into a research career, and in humanities, as much as in other disciplines, the research community is large and diverse, it's international, and it is dynamic above all. And life as a researcher is about a constant exchange of ideas with a very broad network of peers, colleagues, fellow researchers. I think we've, in recent years, moved away from the lone researcher locked away in a library or an archive. I don't think it really is that sort of experience for anyone in the humanities now.
And Emma or Susanna, I don't know if you want to come in on this question of sort of what qualities are required. I mean, we obviously assume that somebody doing a PhD is going to be quite intelligent, but I mean, actually that isn't necessarily sufficient in and of itself. So it's, what qualities do people need to have?
I suppose I'd probably tag persistence as well as being quite an important quality, and a sense that you're prepared to kind of face the challenges that you're going to meet along the way. I mean, it's not necessarily going to be plain sailing. There may be some research questions that you have in your head to start with. You go off and you do some research, find an archive, and hit a dead end, and end up not being able to pursue that particular line of inquiry. But so then being sort of persistent enough to sort of pick yourself up and perhaps go off in a slightly different direction. That's something that
I'd agree with that. I think it's that balance of saying it's great to have an idea that you're passionate about, and at the time when you think, why on earth did I ever start this? Being able to pull back on that passion to say, oh, I remember, is important. But I think persistence, doggedness, really is what gets it done. All kinds of people can be passionate and have big ideas, but it's seeing that through. I think something that often, when I'm talking to prospective students, something that often throws people is this idea of originality and PhD having to make a distinct contribution and so on. I was talking to some of my students earlier actually today, and we said, you need to make an original contribution. There needs to be something in there which is original, but at the same time, of course, you're showing engagement with an existing field. And I think people are often quite frightened by that idea, and we said, there's all kinds of ways to be original. You might be generating original data, but you might be bringing a set of texts into conversation with another set of texts in a way that hasn't been done before. You might be using methodological tools in a particular way. But there's all kinds of ways to do that. So I want to say, don't kind of frightened or turned off by that idea.
And I mean, I think that actually that raises a rather important point, which is that for people who were thinking about drafting a PhD proposal, this seems like an enormous challenge to sort of draw up something which in some way is going to pass muster with acknowledged experts in the field. And yet, of course, you're writing a proposal at a time when you haven't yet done the research. I mean, you've obviously done some background research, but it's how does one approach this problem of trying to come up with some suggestions or ideas which are known to be kind of tentative hypotheses, and yet they're going to kind of grab the attention of experts in the field.
Well, I think you've got to remember that in presenting a proposal, you're not expected to present your conclusions. You haven't done the study yet. It's the questions that every university is looking for. That's what we hope will interest us. So, in fact, don't focus on how can I possibly test out this hypothesis. I'm going to be inadequate if I can't say where this is all going to lead. You don't need to. What you need to do is to outline what those really exciting questions are, and to be able to map out then how you might pursue those questions. What are the materials you're going to use to help take those questions further forward and try to answer them? But you don't have to have all the answers at this stage.
And I think when people see things like some universities ask candidates to create a timeline and say what they'll do when and so on, I think that's a really useful exercise, particularly perhaps if you're doing field work or something where you're going to need to think carefully about timing and fitting that in. But at the same time, no one is going to look back, 2 years in and say, well, you said you were going to write chapter 4 in this month and you're not. So it's not prescriptive in that way. But what it does do is it shows the academics who are reading your proposal, it shows the department that you were applying to, that you've got a realistic idea about what is achievable in 3 years, about the kind of size of project that might be done, without necessarily saying this is exactly how it will play out.
Yeah.
And that's another quality, isn't it, as well? Obviously, time management skills, and making sure you are on track at each sort of point, not panicking too much about it right at the beginning, but making sure you've got some sort of manageable goals and you're working towards completion in that 3-year period.
Yes, you've got to remember it's not an open-ended inquiry. A PhD should have a clear starting point. That's where you set out what the questions are going to be, and you develop that with your active research, perhaps in an archive or doing field work or whatever it might be. But then it must have a clear endpoint. And when you're asked to map out a timeline or to put in a project plan, it's because from the very beginning, there must be an understanding that this will come to an end.
I wonder if anybody wanted to sort of share any personal anecdotes about how it was that they came to devise their own proposal and sort of any obstacles that they found along the way.
I suppose I could share how it happened for me. I mean, I had a slightly kind of circuitous route actually into PhD study, which was that I, back in the day, you applied to the HRB, was it, at that stage. And I think first of all, I didn't get the funding, so I sort of went off and I did something else. But I was really determined that I was going to do this postgraduate study, and I had contacted a potential supervisor and sort of with her talked through some possible options, relating a little bit to my undergraduate study. So I'd already started to do medieval French, which is my area, and I was quite interested in the sort of later period. but I felt a little bit lost in terms of, well, but what do I do within that? And she was the person who was really able to kind of direct me to areas which were perhaps understudied. And it was kind of through conversation with her that I was able to identify a potential topic.
I think that's a really important point that you raised about contact with the supervisor. Maybe we'll return to this later on, but one isn't necessarily expected to devise a fully formed PhD proposal, which is going to be 100% superb in the first instance. That it is partly a process of dialogue. And indeed, I can remember, back in the dark days of the 1990s when you used to write people letters, and I was at the University of Birmingham. I wrote a letter to a potential supervisor who turned out to be my supervisor in due course, and we sort of had an exchange of letters, and eventually I went down and I had a conversation with him sitting in his office, and it was out of that process that the final process, the final proposal emerged from sort of hazy beginnings, and I was sort of guided partly by his interests. Fortunately, they coincided with mine.
And obviously that is the very important point, isn't it? That you, depending on the way you're thinking of studying, you should look at the staff profiles very carefully to see what different research interests are represented and whether those kind of chime with your own, and then perhaps contact some of those individuals. I mean, a little bit like our stories, I've met with a number of prospective PhD students who've sort of contacted me a little bit out of the blue to say they're thinking of doing a PhD, not necessarily even at Exeter, but thinking of doing a PhD in this area. Would I be able to give them any advice? And obviously, any academic is always happy to talk to somebody who's passionate about their area of study.
I wonder if we can move the discussion on and sort of call you in again, James, because it's we're talking to possibly people around the world here, and so the UK PhD isn't necessarily the same as the way that the programs operate in all other countries. So I just wonder if you can talk us through a little bit what is distinctive about a UK PhD and what is expected within what time frame.
Okay, yes, it is quite distinct from many parts of the world. A UK PhD is shorter than most global PhD programs, and so the expectation is that from point of entry to the point at which you've been examined on your finished PhD, you would do that in a 4-year period. Most funding opportunities in the UK will cover at least 3 years of that 4-year period, and some funding packages now will extend over the full 4-year period. I think the main intellectual difference is that you are, in the UK, able to plunge into the research and to the project from the outset. That there aren't the preliminary steps, the large number of mandatory taught courses, still less the large quantity of mandatory teaching expectations that you will find yourself, as you might in some parts of the world, particularly in the US, obliged to deliver so many undergraduate classes almost to earn your keep in a department. That isn't the UK way. We see the PhD as your opportunity to get out there and do your independent research. And if anything, we will go out of our way to ensure there are no obstacles in the way of you going in whichever direction you need to, whether it's to get into the field work straight away, or to open up the archive straight away, or simply to work out precisely what those research questions are. You will be able to hit the ground running with your PhD. Typically, the British PhD has a kind of arc to it, that the first year is the developmental stage, when you really are testing out those ideas, those questions, identifying the objects of study, working out how your project fits into the wider field. The second year, or the second into the third year, is the period where you do tend to do most of your gathering of data, your gathering of material, that is going to form the meat of the PhD. And for most people, the most intense period of writing comes towards the end of the 3 or 4 years. We always encourage PhD students in the UK to start writing and early and to write often, but nonetheless, inevitably, the polished writing that will eventually go before a PhD examiner, generally speaking, happens at the end, in the 3rd and 4th years.
Thanks very much. Now, we've had a question come in from a viewer, which is, will I get career guidance while doing a PhD? So let's answer that question. Maybe Susanna, turn to you for that one.
Yeah, so this is going to vary, of course, depending on which institution you find yourself in and which institution you do your PhD in. But most institutions in Britain will have, if not a discrete graduate school, then some mechanism for delivering graduate skills. So it might be very specific workshops on how to use a particular methodology, how to use a particular piece of software, or it might be something much more general, like how to pitch to journals, how to think about getting published, and so on. And I think in most of those cases, there's the immediate context about what's going to be useful to you as a PhD candidate, directly towards the research you're doing there and then. But generally, they also have a long view. So they're saying, actually, how do I begin to establish myself as a scholar among other scholars in the field? So some of that is going to come, I suppose, centrally from the institution. But individual academic departments, particularly those which are collegial and are working well, that will be something that your supervisory team and the other academics in the department will be very invested in. So finding ways to help you network not only with them, but hopefully with a broader set of academics in the field. So that might mean putting you in touch with particular scholarly networks, suggesting particular conferences, passing on calls for papers and that kind of thing. So yeah, I suppose there's the immediate context, what's useful now, but looking more broadly to what's going to be useful afterwards. It's also important to say that not everybody who does a PhD then goes on to be in academia, and I think that's something we're all acutely aware of, especially with the way the job market is at the moment. So increasingly, universities are saying, actually, what else can you do with a PhD, and how do we ensure that people know that those options are not second best options? Those are perfectly fine options. And thinking about actually how having a PhD makes you very marketable and makes you very desirable in a range of contexts.
I think it's worth adding that most research groups in the humanities in the leading universities are very well networked with a variety of non-academic organisations, arts, media, heritage, cultural organisations, governmental bodies, policy-making bodies, a wide variety, because they are engaged in the kind of research that we do. Often they're directly involved in our projects. They are core audiences, but they're also core collaborators for us. As a result, our PhD students are introduced to these different constituencies at a very early stage in their research careers, and have that opportunity to discover how their research can be directly useful to non-academic organisations and can serve as the basis for a career in one of those bodies.
Yeah, I suppose I'd also mention something James said, sort of spark this off, collaborative doctoral awards as well. So that's always something to look out for, an award that's offered in association with one of these kind of partner institutions. So I'm just thinking about a specific PhD that I've recently supervised with a sort of global multimedia firm, well, based internationally, but with a branch in London. And as it turned out, the person that I was supervising has in fact now got an offer to go and work in this particular firm, so decided not to sort of pursue academia as such, but to go and work for this firm. And during the course of his PhD, he had kind of short periods interning at that partner institution. So that's something where you can kind of divide your time in a way between academia and the world of work and get that valuable experience.
Good. So I think that, as you mentioned, collaborative doctoral awards, it would be a good idea to move to another question that has come in, which is what type of funding is available for international students, and we might perhaps also use that question as a route into talking about funding more generally. So I suppose that maybe I'll be looking both to James and to Matt to contribute to that question if you want to go first.
Okay, the leading UK universities will generally offer studentships, fully funded studentships for international students. These are likely to be open to students from any international location, and they often will be open to any discipline, whether it's the humanities, but also other disciplines on offer at that university. So that will vary from institution to institution. Some, such as Exeter, do offer international studentships exclusively for students in the humanities, but that isn't always the case, and it's worth doing some research to see where the best funding opportunities for international students happen to be available. Those will be awarded purely on academic merit. So the strength of the research proposal, just how exciting are those research questions that are being brought forward. They will be assessed, generally speaking, also by interview, whether that's a Skyped interview or whether the applicant is available in person to meet with the university. And they will make it possible then to usually have funded at least the first 3 years of the PhD program.
And it's also probably worth mentioning that as an aspect of funding more generally, sometimes there will be specific funded research projects, for example, through the Leave Trust or the Wellcome Trust, which come through where you'll be asked to do a PhD in a particular, quite specific area of history. I'm going to give a concrete example because I've recently been part of a project on British and French imperial rhetoric from the 1880s to the 1950s, which had 2 PhD studentships attached. And we basically asked people to come forward with their ideas for proposals in that general area. And we were happily able to select 2 excellent students who are now just coming up to completion. And so don't be put off those because if they seem sort of overly specific, or because there's certainly room for sort of putting forward your own ideas and sort of negotiating to an extent. Matt, did you have anything to add on funding?
Well, I'm mainly involved in the practical side of applying for it. So we generally ask, the documentation you use to apply for funding is very similar to the documentation you use to apply for PhD. So obviously the proposal and degrees, transcripts and a personal statement. We also ask for 2 references. We aren't advertising at the moment. We hope to get them online maybe later on in November or early December. But I am maintaining a list a contact list. So if you want to be added to the contact list, just email me at humanities-pgadmissions, all one word, at exeter.ac.uk, and I can send you a heads up when they go online.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Now, if we can return to a question again, which has come in, but we did discuss this a bit more at the beginning, but I think since we can't discuss this too much, is what are the keys to a successful research proposal? And I suppose that one might say that we've got to be aware that there are different expectations depending on different disciplines. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all model. I don't know if Susanna, you could say something a little about how theology will approach the problem.
I think what we would hope to see would be that you've thought about some of the specificities, and as we said earlier, that doesn't necessarily mean this is set in stone and this is exactly what you will do. But we want to know, for example, within theology and religion, as for some other disciplines, there's a set of subfields within that. So actually you might be a philologist, you might be a biblical scholar, you might be an ethicist, you might be a church historian, you might be doing all sorts of things. So part of this is saying, I can show you that I can situate myself within my specific subfield. I'm aware of the debates in that subfield. I'm aware of the key scholars, the key themes, the key discussions. So we would be looking for almost a mini literature review within the proposal, which shows that you're aware of the context, but also beginning to hint at actually how you're going to go beyond that. So what is it that you want to do which is original? Not only how are you building on what has gone before, but how will others be able to come along and build on what you do? So you're making a contribution to the field, and others will come along after you and build on that as well. Useful to have an idea as to your methodology, which in simple terms is how are you going to do this? How are you going to go about doing what you want to do? And in particular, as James hinted, although with a British PhD, we like to get you going as early as possible, there might be specific skills that you need before you can do that. So if you're moving into an empirical field where you haven't been before, you might need specific training in conducting fieldwork in research methods. If you're doing research with human subjects, probably you're going to need to go through the ethical approval process, which your supervisory team will be able to help talk you through, but all of that takes time. So another reason for having a timeline as part of the proposal is to say, has this candidate taken into account that actually not only do they need to go through the ethical approval process, but then once they've generated data, they're going to need to possibly transcribe it and do some analysis and so on. Have they taken into account that all of that takes time? I think the other thing as well is we want to see that you've got an idea about what is and isn't realistic in the time. So it's great to have big and expansive and kind of generative ideas. That's so important. But there needs to be a little bit of realism in there as well. So you might have an absolutely amazing, dazzling, academically robust idea, but it's going to take at least 8 years and £1 million to do it. And unfortunately, we probably can't offer you either of them. So do you have an idea about how to make this PhD sized? Is this something that you can do in 3 years with the resources available to you? So those would be the sorts of things that we're looking for, some of which is, I think, applicable across a range of disciplines.
Do you have anything to add from the modern languages perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I would completely agree with all of that, and obviously there are quite a lot of things which are generic to all research proposals, and very important, you know, Susanna was saying, to kind of keep it simple in some ways, and to, rather than starting from a really complicated idea and trying to kind of crowbar it into something smaller, to kind of start off from the really simple idea and to kind of build on it and make it a little bit bigger, something that can be completed in that time frame. Like theology and religion, obviously modern languages also has a number of different subfields. So things like, again, philology, you know, textual criticism, linguistics, cultural history, literary studies. And you could be working across a number of these. You know, you don't have to be sort of slap bang in the centre of one of them. But it's very important in the methodology section to identify exactly how you are situated, if you're situated across certain, you know, methodological boundaries, or if you're kind of firmly in one, and make sure that you're very, very clear about that. I suppose the other thing to bear in mind is, particularly for modern languages, are you going to be using archives which are not UK based, and therefore, you know, to be aware that there might be costs involved in terms of your sort of travelling to use these archives. And also identifying the particular places that you need to be to use the particular archives that you need to use. So, you know, do you need to be at this particular archive in the southwest that you need to use? Then, you know, Exeter might be ideal. If there are archives elsewhere, are you going to be able to, you know, if you're based in a particular place, can you get to them easily? Can you travel? You know, and sort of factoring all of that in really to your methodology and to your thinking about how achievable this PhD will be.
That's very helpful. I mean, I suppose that one might also add that you know, in these days of the web, that some of the preliminary research that is needed for drawing up a PhD proposal, well, then we talk specifically about history, because I want to suggest that things are the same across all disciplines, although there are many disciplines apart from history that make use of archival resources. for example. But one can do quite easily these days research online to at least identify whether or not you can say that there's a significant number of files that exist in a particular archive which have got the title, whatever it is. Now that obviously doesn't guarantee that they contain interesting information, but they show that you've kind of done your due diligence and your sort of preliminary work to show that you've actually got a concrete and specific idea of how you might deal with these problems, as well as a general intellectual idea. I mean, I think that I do have a fairly specific recipe. I mean, it's maybe personal to me, it wouldn't work for every project, but the recipe which I suggest to people is really comprises 4 things for a successful research proposal. The first one is, why is this question important? That's the fundamental thing. Secondly, what have people previously said about this? Thirdly, in what ways is what people have previously said about this lacking, sort of wrong, deficient, or in need of supplementing? Now, that doesn't mean that you have to show that everybody who's written about this previously has got it completely wrong or is a fool, but you do have to show, perhaps, at the very least, that there are important elements that they have overlooked. And the fourth thing is how you are going to use primary sources in order to address those deficiencies. And so that's kind of my single 4-point recipe. I don't know if James, that sort of coincides with...
Yeah, absolutely. I think really to pinpoint what is significant about what it is that you're asking, what you're trying to do, and how you can, as you say, either build on what's gone before or in some way offer a corrective to what's gone before. But it absolutely doesn't need to be sweeping everything that's gone before away as if simply because it's already out there, it is of no value. We're not looking for a kind of neophyte approach where just because I'm doing it new, it's more valuable than everything else. By no means, and don't become overly preoccupied with a search for originality. And as Emma and Suzanne have been saying, ambition should always be tempered by realism. And a good PhD is one that's finished, fundamentally. And every university in every discipline, but perhaps especially in the humanities, we know of great ideas that have foundered because an end was never properly in view. And I would always favour, when it comes to funding, something whose take-home message in a proposal was, it's doable, it will be done, and there will be a substantial and interesting piece of work at the end of it. And every university would rather put its money behind that than something that is going to discover a new galaxy but can't tell us when it will happen.
Okay, that's very helpful. I think that it occurs to me that we've been chucking some terms around, perhaps during the discussion, that sort of need further explanation or clarification. So we keep saying supervisory team, for example, and I think that leads to the sort of the broader point of how, once you've embarked on a PhD, is this actually going to work? Who are your supervisors? What is the nature of your relationship with them? What should they be providing you with, and what are your responsibilities as a student in return? Emma, could I ask you to touch on that?
Yeah, well, the supervisory team, certainly taking the example of Exeter, and I think it's very similar in a lot of places, will be made up not just of one person, but it will be a team who will all be looking out for you, will be able to discuss your progress, or lack of it, with all of them. Generally, you would have a primary supervisor, but you might also have, certainly here, you'd always have a second supervisor, and that could be somebody who was in the area that you're working in, but equally it could be somebody who was in a parallel area. Obviously, if you've got a comparative topic, you might have one person, say, in English studies, another supervisor in history, and that way you would sort of complete your team would be completed. The expertise that they were able to offer would cover all of the areas that you were covering in your thesis. And generally, we also have a mentor who offers a slightly different level of support to the student throughout their PhD. We also have regular, what we call GPCs, Graduate Progress Committees, which is an opportunity for you to submit some work beforehand, which is read by your supervisory team, and then they're able to offer you some concrete advice in that Graduate Progress Committee towards particular goals, completion of chapters, that kind of thing. And that's in addition to your regular meetings with your supervisors. I don't know if there's anything that...
I think we might talk on the upgrade aspect as well, so that it is quite usual at many universities, whether or not the term upgrade is used, to have a kind of, probably about a third of the way through the PhD, a process whereby, having initially been registered for a lower degree, such as the name of Phil, you submit work which is then carefully examined by academics and discussed with you with a view to making sure that you really are making sufficient progress towards the PhD and that you have a realistic time frame for completion. And again, James said earlier about the importance of writing early, and that is a formal requirement generally, that one would provide a substantial piece of written work together with a kind of a proposal that was updated in the light of the research that one had done over one's first year or so, and some kind of schedule for completion. And in a sense, that is a useful experience, because that is your first taste, perhaps, of the eventual examination process, the viva examination, the oral examination, which takes place at the end of the PhD, which of course is something which, understandably enough, makes a lot of people rather anxious. Of course, if you're sufficiently, you don't need to be anxious. But of course, that experience of again, this comes back to the point that doing a PhD is about more than simply be prepared for it, and you've got a good thesis that you don't need to be anxious. But of course, that experience of again, this comes back to the point that doing a PhD is about more than simply writing an excellent piece, a very substantial piece of written work. It is about being able to articulate and defend propositions that you're putting forward in an academic forum. Now, again, we go back to the differences between the UK system and other systems. In the UK system, the viva, the examination, basically just involves 3 people in the room, an internal examiner. That is quite different from perhaps the more grueling experience that takes place in some European countries, for example, of the public defence of the university and the candidate, possibly with, in some cases, with the supervisor or with an independent chair present too. That is quite different from perhaps the more grueling experience that takes place in some European countries, for example, of the public defence, which is sort of being quizzed on your thesis by maybe more than one renowned expert in front of maybe an audience of hundreds of people. So, I'm not saying that one is superior to the other, but some people might prefer the more intimate setting to the more public one. Now, I think we're coming towards the end of our time. If anyone has any final reflections that they would like to offer on any points that we've raised, or whether I should at this point conclude.
I think I would just say now that the Humanities PhD today is a launchpad to not only a very productive career in academic research, but in the application of research in a wide variety of other contexts. And this is a great moment to think about doing a PhD, consequently, that the opportunities are widening.
Thank you very much. So I think that the final point is that, of course, we hope that this webinar has been useful to anybody who's contemplating a humanities PhD anywhere in the world. But of course, we are very keen that excellent candidates apply to Exeter, and certainly we'd encourage you to get in touch with any of us if you have any specific questions, but also to look at the College of Humanities website, and to look at the websites, the web pages of the particular departments that you might be interested in order to identify potential supervisors, and consider contacting them, really as soon as possible if you're thinking about applying for the next academic year. As I said earlier on, your ideas do not have to be 100% worked out at this stage. That it may be that you're simply, identifying an area that's of interest to you and opening a dialogue. So we hope that all academics at Exeter will be very receptive to hearing your ideas. And essentially, I want to conclude by thank you for watching, and again to encourage you, if you do have an interest in pursuing a PhD here at the University of Exeter, even if you're not certain that is what you want to do, please do get in touch. Thank you very much.